Hey, I'm Molly. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm talking all about my sourdough winter baking tips. So baking sourdough in the winter can be a little more difficult or a little different than you're used to, especially in the summer months. I live in Middle Tennessee, so it gets very humid in the summer and very hot, which means my sourdough acts much different than in the winter. We do get pretty cold winters, like we're not freezing like where I grew up in Indiana. Here in Middle Tennessee, it does get cold. Your sourdough starter is going to act differently in different weather because it is a live cultured thing. When your sourdough starter is warm, it's going to ferment much faster, which means your starter is going to rise much more and it's going to need fed much more than normal. When it's cold, your starter is going to be less active, meaning it's going to take a lot longer to rise, it's going to take a lot longer to ferment, and it's going to need to be fed less, which is why it kind of makes sense, because when you feed your starter and you leave it out on the counter, you need to feed it once every day. In the summer, you need to feed it twice a day. But if you feed your starter and place it in your refrigerator, you only have to feed it once a week. So think of this on a much smaller scale. When it's cold outside, it's going to take a little longer to ferment. When it's hot outside, it's going to take less time to ferment and it's going to go quick. And a lot of people think, well, my house is the same temperature, but that doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is the outside temperature, the drafts in your home, what temperature your house is set at. So in the summer, our home is set at 72 with our air conditioner. In the winter, our house is set at 68 with the heat on. So because of that, it is much cooler in here by 4 degrees in the winter time and 4 degrees warmer in the summer. So during the winter time, when I need this guy to rise or I need dough to rise, this oven is my best friend, and I'm going to get into that. But first, I want to talk about the common issues when baking with sourdough in the winter. So some common issues I wanted to talk about first when sourdough baking is starting with an inactive starter and a sluggish starter. Like we just talked about, the cooler temperatures slow this guy down. And then your dough is not doubling is another common issue, which we're going to get into how to fix all of these in a second. But when your dough doesn't double and your bread becomes dense, and then your starter and your dough is more dry than normal. So those are the common issues that people run into with sourdough baking in the wintertime, and I'm going to tell you how to fix all of them. So to fix the slow and sluggish starter, you're going to need to make this guy very active and strong. You're going to want to do that by feeding it only unbleached flour and filtered water. When you use bleached flour in your sourdough starter, especially during winter, your starter is already cold and having a little bit of a sluggish time. When you put that bleached flour in here, it's not going to help anything. It's going to cause more harm than good. So using the unbleached flour is going to help it thrive. There's no bromates or bleaches in that flour that's going to slow your starter down or even kill it. And then also your filtered water is very important because the chlorine, especially in city water, can slow or kill your starter as well. So using that unbleached flour and filtered water is key. Also, you need to feed your starter at least once a week, and when you feed it, you need to do a 2-to-1 ratio of flour to water. So it's going to depend how much you feed your starter depending how large of a jar you have. You never want to fill your starter jar more than halfway full after you feed it, because it is going to ferment and rise, and you need at least half of the room for it to grow. So for this guy, sometimes I'll feed him a large quantity or sometimes I'll feed him a small one. But for an example, the 2-to-1 ratio is, say, 1 cup of flour and half of a cup of water. So that's the ratio you're going to use. And then you're going to want to feed your starter that ratio of unbleached flour and filtered water at least once a week. After you feed it, you need to let it sit on the counter for 4 to 6 hours so that it can get warm and rise before popping it in the fridge. This is huge for wintertime, and if you struggle with dense breads or baked goods that are not really good and gummy during the winter, the reason why is your starter is just sluggish and slow and it needs help. And then lastly, for your slow and sluggish starter, you need to feed it 4 to 12 hours before you start any recipe that calls for fed starter. So to recap this section for fixing a slow and sluggish starter, there's no bubbles, it's not rising. You need to feed it a 2-to-1 ratio of unbleached flour and filtered water. You need to do this once a week minimal. And after you feed it, you need to let it sit on the countertop for 4 to 6 hours before placing it in the fridge for storage. Let's move on to the next section of making your dough rise and actually double in size during your bulk fermentation and proofing. When you are bulk fermenting any kind of sourdough dough, this is the first set of fermentation or rising. And then the proofing is the second set. So after you shape your actual dough into a bread loaf or into buns or whatever you're using, that is the proofing section, the second rise. Either way, you need to put your dough in a warm area during this time. The biggest issue with your dough not doubling in size during winter is because it's cold and it needs help. These two rising times are so important for having fluffy baked goods that are not gummy and dense. So to get that dough to double in size during both the bulk ferment and the proofing, you need to place it in a warm area because in the winter it's cold even inside and there's more drafts. So what I like to do, and what all of you can do, you're going to place your dough during the bulk ferment and during the proof or the second rise in your oven. So for your oven, you can either heat it up to about 75, 80 degrees, which you can do that with a temperature thermometer, or you can turn it on just barely, let it heat up for about 15 seconds, and then turn it off. It should be just barely warm when you stick your hand in the oven. You do not want your oven to be too hot, otherwise it's going to mess with your bread and kind of bake it. So 75 to 80 degrees. If you don't feel comfortable doing that or messing with it, you can also turn your oven light on and crack your door just ever so slightly. This allows a little bit of air to come out because some oven lights can heat your oven over 100 degrees if they're newer and have an LED bulb. So let's recap this section quick. If your dough is not doubling in size, you need to place it in a warm spot to rise and proof. So for the bulk fermentation and the second rise or proofing. You can do this two ways. The first way is getting your oven to 75 to 80 degrees and then placing it inside with the oven door shut. The other option that you can do if you don't feel comfortable with that is turning your oven light on, cracking your oven door ever so slightly, and sticking your dough in there. Both of these are going to help your dough rise and double in size for both the bulk ferment and the proof, and you're not going to have dense baked goods, and this eliminates any issue of your dough being flat. Now, I do want to make a quick note. If your dough still isn't rising after it's been warm for 12 hours, that means you have a problem with your sourdough starter and it's inactive. So rewind, go back to the sourdough starter tips of how to feed it. Make sure you do all of that if your dough is still dense and it's still not doubling in size even when it's warm. Okay, now that we've went over those things, I'm just going to share a speed round kind of quick tips to help you. Number one is make sure your starter is always active if you're making a bread item or a baked good that calls for fed starter. It needs to be active, which means it needs to have been fed 4 to 12 hours before you use it. It needs to be bubbly. Second, you need to always let your dough bulk ferment for about 12 hours in the winter time. It is too cold to do any less than that. When you proof your dough after you shape it, it needs to proof for 3 to 4 hours during the winter to make sure you're getting that double in size. If your dough has not doubled in size, you can even add on 2 more hours and do 6 hours. That way you can make sure your dough is going to be really fluffy and light after you bake it. Number 3 is always finding a warm place to have your dough rise. Now, if you don't like the idea of the oven, you can buy some kind of proofing box, or they make little proofing warmer mats. You can do either of those. And finally, I'm going to answer a few of your baking questions. So how to help sourdough rise in winter. You're going to want to place it in a warm place, like a turned off oven with the light on and the door cracked, or an oven that's heated to 75 to 80 degrees. How cold is too cold for sourdough? This is a huge one. And really anything below 70 is a little too chilly, but really 68 degrees and lower is going to be really hard to ferment a dough quickly. So your dough might take 24 hours instead of 12 if it's 68 degrees in your home. That is why it's so important to find a warm place to rise your dough. Next is why is my sourdough starter sluggish in winter? It's really just because your starter is cold and your starter might be a little inactive because it needs more food. The next question is, how often should I feed my sourdough starter in the winter? In the winter time, you need to feed your starter at least once a week, and that's putting it in the fridge. You can also leave it out on the countertop, but you're gonna need to feed it once a day if you leave it there. If you put it in the refrigerator, it can be fed once a week. If you do get a little behind or something and you don't have time to feed your starter or use it, it's totally fine. You can let it go until you actually have time, even if it's another week or two. These guys are really resilient. And then the last question today is, why doesn't my sourdough rise even in the oven? This, like we talked about earlier, is because your starter health is not there. It's not active enough. So you need to go back, make sure you feed your starter the correct way, that 2-to-1 ratio of unbleached flour and filtered water, and you need to let it sit out on the counter for 4 to 12 hours before using it. That way, when you do put it in a warmed oven, it's going to double in size. I hope this video was very helpful and informational. I will leave my sourdough baking tips down below. I have a link for my blog post. I talk about all of this stuff, answer more questions, and you can read all of the instructions as well as find my ratio feeding guide. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned a little bit more about sourdough baking. Until next time, go make your home a priority.